Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? Walk right, please. Thank you. So here we go. We're going to be talking about a very, very important event taking place in the early stages of the Cold War, where things are going to get really pretty brutal and really tough for the United States of America. And it's not actually going to get all completely resolved. We're talking about the situation in Korea. Okay, so I'm going to give you the notes, and then we're going to have you take a look directly at the Cold War video, episode number 5. Got the key terms right there for you on page 3, episode number 5. Let's get on to it. Okay, don't forget to do this as well. I know some of you guys are working real hard on your rough drafts for your IAs. Yeah, get those in. Don't forget to do this video either. Okay. All right. Let's see. Share screen. All right, here we go. All right, so we're looking at the situation in Korea. Let's remind ourselves what happened with respect to Korea. During World War II, Korea was occupied by the Japanese. Actually, had been occupied for many years before that time period. And let me see, who beat the Japanese in World War II? It was the United States. However, as you know, one of the deals that the United States struck with the Soviets was to, for the Soviets, late in the game, nevertheless, to declare war against Japan. Didn't do a lot of fighting against Japan, but as a result of that, there was an agreement that the Soviets would occupy that area of northern China where the Japanese troops were. And here we go, make sure you have this down. The agreement was that the Soviets would occupy the area of Korea above the 38th parallel. So that's why you've got this dividing line going on right here between the northern part of Korea and the southern part of Korea, specifically on the 38th parallel. You would have Soviet troops in the north, you would have the United States troops and so forth in the southern part of Korea. Of course, you had the United States troops in Japan. And the idea was that, I suppose, just like Japan ultimately was able to have its own government and the United States pulled its troops out. Same thing with Korea. But as we saw, that didn't quite work out in Germany, did it? You ended up ultimately having two separate Germanys, West and East. That's kind of what you're going to have as well in Korea. By 1948, right, it only took about 3 years to figure out this is going to be the way. By 1948, the southern part of Korea is going to be organized as the Republic of Korea, right? And you're going to have an anti-communist regime in there, not fully democratic, not for some time. I mean, it's going to be capitalist, but it's definitely going to be anti-communist. In the north, the Soviets will make sure that there will be established what is called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also now known as simply North Korea. And it is going to be pro-communist, right? The Soviets going to make sure that there's a communist leader there. And gosh, and of course, both sides are thinking, well, would it be nice if Korea was unified again? Well, the folks in North Korea are like, well, can we make that happen? Can we like, hey, Stalin, can we like invade? So what you're going to see here as we go through this unit is this map, and we're going to be referring a lot to the maps here. There we go. North Korea, you can go ahead and write this down. North Korea starts the war, and they're going to attack, and then they're going to push deeply into South Korea, almost win. And then there will be a reversal, and with the help of the United States and other forces under the auspices of the United Nations, the North Koreans will be pushed back out of South Korea. And in fact, they're going to lose a lot of their own territory until later. The Chinese, here, take a look at the second map here. The Chinese will get into the war. And we're talking about Chinese, we're talking about the new communist Chinese, and they're going to push all the way back down to the 38th parallel, and you're going to have back and forth, back and forth. Ultimately, you're going to kind of have a stalemate by the time this war is, I wouldn't say officially over, but you're going to get an armistice. And then at the end of the war, you will have not exactly along the 38th parallel, but a demilitarized zone kind of like right here. You see this green line right here. And that's where the boundaries of North and South Korea are today. So anyway, there's a quick look at how that plays out. And we'll take a close look as we develop it in turn. Let's take a look here. Here we go. Here is our South Korean leader, head of the Republic of China, president, anti-communist. Yeah, it's going to be a while before democracy is going to take root in South Korea, but it will take root in South Korea. Capitalism will definitely take root, and it already had. So there we got Syngman Rhee from 1948 onwards. In North Korea, there we go. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. North Korean president is Kim Il-sung, young pro-communist, and yeah, he's very much, Stalin likes this guy. He's like, yeah, we like this guy. And by the way, in case you're wondering, it stays in the family. Yeah. Kim Il-sung will be followed by his son, Kim Jong-il, who will rule for many, many years. And then the current leader hasn't been in there for too long. He's still fairly young, Kim Jong-un, although if you've been following in the news at all, question, is he healthy? Is he safe? Where is he? He hasn't been in public for quite some time. Rumors about him being on like life support or dead or who knows what. So, I mean, it is an interesting question. Who will be the next leader? I mean, this is like you've got this communist totalitarian dictatorship, and it is it's the worst in the world. I mean, there's a lot of bad ones, but this is just a horrible, horrible situation. But it's almost hereditary. So apparently, I don't know, I haven't seen any pictures. I looked. Kim Jong-un actually has a son, but it's like, you know, an infant son. I mean, like maybe a toddler. If he was dead, if he was gone, who would take over? With his sister, Kim Yo-jong. I don't know, that would be different. It's a bit of paternalistic society in Korea, perhaps. But anyway, we'll let you guys figure that out. Maybe by the time you watch this video, we'll have more information and news. But needless to say, we are getting ahead of ourselves. Although it is very important because, as you can see, the government in North Korea, first run by Kim Il-sung, then Kim Jong-il, then Kim Jong-un, it's there. And it is not necessarily friendly to the United States. And for their national security, they have moved toward developing nuclear weapons. They got that, check that off. And they're also moving toward developing multi-stage ballistic missiles, like multi-stage ballistic missiles, so that it can go up and then get another kick, so they can go a long way. I mean, what difference does that make to the United States of America? Oh, a multi-stage ballistic missile could actually hit the United States of America. So, anyway, should we get back to the Korean War? I mean, the situation is still with us, but let's get to the details of the Korean War and how it played out, okay? All right. So, things you need to know relative to the situation that's going to lead to the Korean War. We have talked about this before. The Chinese Civil War ultimately, after many years, resolved itself by October of 1949 with the communists winning complete control over the continent there. Mao Zedong, the communist leader, becomes declares the People's Republic of China. The only part that he doesn't have control over is Taiwan, and we'll keep an eye on that one as well. They remain the Republic of China with some protection from the United States of America. But Mao immediately goes to formalize positive relationship with the Soviet Union, right? So you got Mao and you've got Stalin meeting, having a friendship treaty. They're actually getting along pretty well in those early days. Later, there'll be some tensions between the two countries, particularly as they take on different leaders, but we'll cover that relationship later on. But at this stage, they're together and they're looking and they're concerned about the United States. You got the United States and Japan, you got the United States and South Korea. And of course, Stalin he's been meeting with the North Korean dictator, Kim. And Kim's like, can I get some support? Because I'm really thinking I'd like to unify Korea. Come on, I mean, let's get this thing done. The United States has nuclear weapons. Although, August of 1949, the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. What's been busy on Stalin's mind through much of late 48 and early 49? The Berlin airlift crisis and that whole thing. But as that resolves itself, as you move into 1949 and go on into 1950, ultimately, it says it right there, Stalin You know, it says here, you can have some of this and you can, I will give you support. In fact, I will give you equipment. Now the Soviets don't send their troops in because there's US troops in South Korea. And the Soviets don't want to have their troops go up directly against US troops because US troops do this and Soviet troops do this, and then they go on, and you could build up until ultimately both sides end up using their biggest weapons against each other. World War III. Keep an eye on that. This is going to be one of the first conflicts where you're going to have a concern about, well, are the Soviets and the United States going to face off directly? There is a little bit of that. There's going to be some Soviet pilots involved in the Korean War who will be flying their MiG jet fighters and come into conflict with the United States pilots who are flying jet fighters as well. But for the most part, it's going to, you're not going to have the Soviet troops there. But there is going to be a lot of support from the Soviet Union as far as equipment. So there you have it. On June 25th, 1950, the Korean War starts. The 38th parallel, the dividing line, is crossed by North Korean troops. Stalin gives the okay, the North Koreans cross. They've got 10 divisions with Soviet tanks, not Soviet tank drivers, but Soviet tanks. The United States is not ready for it. We weren't ready for something coming up. We need to be ready for things coming out of Asia. We didn't have a real contingency plan, and it's not going to be very good at all, right? I mean, you saw that first map where the United States and the South Korean forces are pushed back very, very, very quickly. I mean, U.S. forces like, oh, we're here to occupy. I mean, it's like, it's a piece of cake. It's kind of like, you know, whatever in Japan and so forth. No, there's a war. There's a war going on here, okay? There's a war. Now, the United States and South Korea, of course, go to the new United Nations, right? And we're like, oh, you guys aren't going to be like the League of Nations and just sit around and do nothing. The United States puts a proposal, and of course, the bad guys are North Korea, and they're supported by the Soviet Union, so they look like the bad guys. The United States is like, come on, United Nations, support South Korea. And so a resolution goes to the United Nations Security Council, right? You can see these guys all sitting here, and it's got vast majority support, right? And you know, the French and the British and the other, you know, rotating members of the Security Council, they're all like, yeah, this looks really good. And at this point, the Chinese seat had not been handed over to the communist in China, so that it was still the Republic of China seat. Soviets walked out, right? They boycotted the United Nations. I suppose if they looked a little bit more carefully at how things looked, I mean, you could have everybody in the Security Council of the United Nations supporting South Korea against North Korea, but the Soviets could have just vetoed it. They didn't. They walked out. So here you go. Put this down. The United Nations came on board officially in favor of South Korea and against North Korea, because North Korea was the aggressor, right? Now, the main organizer of the military response, of course, is going to be the United States. And the United States main commander is going to be Douglas MacArthur. We'll talk about him more. But to just give you a sense of like how many people are going to be involved, we get some more odds of 16 different nations. Some of them are going to be contributing troops. Some of them are going to contribute other various different forms of support to try and turn things around before South Korea is completely defeated. Let me go through here and identify. Oh, here we go. For your information, you always have some fun seeing if students can guess who's part of this coalition. And some of them are pretty easy as far as like the troops. Again, mostly United States troops, but there's going to be a significant number that will come from other countries that are like allies of ours. So, for example, see if you can figure this out. All right, this should be a surprise. Britain, Canada, allies from the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand, France, of course, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg also will contribute troops. Turkey and Greece, and these are all part of our NATO alliance. So far, we haven't mentioned any countries that are not part of the NATO alliance, with exceptions of Australia and New Zealand, because they're not North Atlantic, they're like South Pacific. Here are some other countries that will provide some troops, not masses of numbers of troops, but you know, positive relations with the United States and so forth. Philippines, Thailand. From South America, Colombia. From Africa, Ethiopia. Now, this is before we had a whole bunch of independent African nations, but Ethiopia had regained its independence. And then finally, also from Africa, South Africa will contribute troops. As far as medical units supporting the United Nations will come from Denmark, Italy, Norway, Sweden, and India. Right? So that's where you're going to get United Nations support, again, under the overall command of the American General, Douglas MacArthur. Okay, let me get back to where I am in my notes here. Okay, yes. All right. So, Douglas MacArthur, speaking of which, remember him from World War II? He was the general who was in charge of the United States troops in the Philippines, and the Japanese came in, and he's like, oh, I shall return, and he did, right? So he's a successful American commander in World War II, and he's going to be the commander of the United States United Nations troops in the Korean War, and he comes up with a really good plan, okay? Right? It's kind of spelled out here on the left and so forth. And if you can, this map isn't that helpful, is it? There's nothing in English, right? So, all right, here, let me identify this. You see this right in the southeast corner? That's the Pusan perimeter, right? There's the city Pusan, and that's where the US and South Korean forces have basically held on, you know, under the onslaught of the initial North Korean assault. MacArthur does an end round in September of 1950. You see right here where this blue arrow is? He does an amphibious assault, a successful amphibious assault, particularly using the United States Navy and so forth. They land behind the lines of the North Koreans right here, and it's a big deal. The North Koreans like, whoa, and so they start retreating, and Douglas MacArthur's landing these troops, and they recapture Seoul, the capital city, which is just a little bit south of the 38th parallel, and they keep moving up. They capture Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, and they keep moving up. I mean, they're heading all the way up to the border with the People's Republic of China. And that's where things get kind of interesting. And it's like, whoa, this war started out bad from the US and South Korea's perspective, but now it's going really, really well. Let's just get this thing done. And, you know, pa-pa-da-pa-dam. And in fact, you know, MacArthur is giving advice saying, you know, I think we ought to just, you know, maybe we could not only turn back the, you know, the communist influence in North Korea, maybe we could just, like, you know, fix the result of the Chinese situation too. Right? I mean, it's just across the water, just across, literally right along this border, northern border between North Korea and China. It's what's called the Yalu River. It's the Yalu River. There's Douglas MacArthur. And he's looking at this Yalu River. It's like, well, we got Chinese logistical support and Soviet logistical support and troops and things, or at least equipment and so forth coming in through here. And yeah, come on, let's just bomb it. You know, what do we have to worry about? I mean, it's interesting though, because Truman is not really interested in having this war expand. Okay, so as you get to the month of October, I mean, things are moving fast in the early stages of the Korean War. And MacArthur is the commander, and he's looking and going, you know, I know what I'm doing, and I can do this thing. I mean, the communists in China, they're still pretty fresh, and we can turn that thing back. And, you know, and hey, you know, the other side is operating on the other side, the north side of the Yalu River. Maybe we can just take them. What do you think? And our bombing raids and so forth right along here in the circled area, they become a little bit too close to the Chinese. And of course, the Chinese are, you know, Mao is getting concerned that, you know, there could be an effort. And they're itching to get involved into the war directly. Stalin's like, you go ahead, Mao, you do that. And the communists in China get involved. Surprise, surprise. October 19, 1950, boom. China joins the Korean War with over 500,000 soldiers. They just come streaming across. and quickly outnumber the United States forces, the UN forces, and they just start falling back. So it's this seesaw war now. They just start falling back into the cold months of the late 1950 and into early 1951. It is bad. It is very bad for the United States forces. And they're taking heavy casualties. The Chinese are taking heavy casualties as well. But the Chinese are like, man, we are going, they're like a new country. They're like, we're going to fight against those Americans. Da, 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 da. We're going to help our North Korean allies. And da, 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 da. And it's just like, I mean, it's just like, it's tough. It is very, 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 very tough. You can see they ultimately, Chinese force the United States forces, UN forces back south across the 38th parallel, but eventually we will hold. In the meantime, I mean, this is like, what the heck? Something I found out many, many years later about the Korean War. I didn't realize this. In the neighborhood I was growing up as a kid in elementary school, there was a neighbor down the street, Mr. Taplett. You know, he had just retired from like the post office. 6 kids, you know, and they were doing stuff and hanging out and so forth. I had no idea until many, many, many years later that he was a colonel in the United States Marine Corps, and he was in charge of the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marine, and they were heavily involved in the Korean War. Right? They fought in the battle around Pusan. They were involved in the Incheon landing, and in the retreat, the very difficult retreat from these Chinese communist assault. They were fighting in the cold, cold winter around the Chosin Reservoir, which is, I want to say, kind of like right in here. And I mean, it is bad. You'll see that in the film, in the Cold War film, where you know he started out with what, about 1,300 in his unit. After the fighting and all of the assault and so forth, I think he had like about 326 able-bodied men, and the rest were lost, captured, and then he got them out. I mean, he got those guys out, and it was not an easy thing to do. He was ultimately awarded with the Navy Cross for his efforts as a leader in the United States Marine Corps during the Korean War. First time I knew him was Mr. Taplett down the street. You know, you talk to people and you'll find out some very, very interesting stories in your neighborhood. The guy down the street. So we did ultimately hold the line. Of course, then there's these questions of, well, what can we do? What do we have available to us to really turn this thing around? And people are asking, you know, they're asking President Truman, you know, should we bomb China? Of course, MacArthur's like, well, yeah, I mean, come on, we should bomb China. Should the United States use atomic bombs? I mean, our allies, the British, are like, oh, you know, because if you ramp it up, this is interesting. This is a hot war in the Cold War, but it's limited. You can have a number of these engagements during the Cold War that are limited. There's a sense that if you use everything you can in order to carry out a victory, you might end up risking a larger war, a World War III. And we're going to see that dynamic coming back again and again and again. And Truman's like, you know, we're going to just have to use conventional warfare. We're going to limit ourselves and so forth. And I mean, we did. We pushed back on that. Of course, there's a disagreement. MacArthur, Marty's getting out. MacArthur got some different plans, and he understands the military a little bit better than, you know, Truman. He used to be what, vice president, and haberdasher from Missouri. I mean, before he got into politics and so forth. But Truman is, you know, buck stops here kind of guy. He does not mince words with somebody who tries to not follow his direction. The commander-in-chief is the president of the United States, not Douglas MacArthur. And Truman had had just about enough. On April 11th, 1951, Truman fired MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had been fairly popular. In fact, he came back to the United States. Some people are like, well, maybe he'll run for president in 1952, you know, former military. You could run for president. Actually, a former military in the United States military will be elected president in the fall of 1952. It's not going to be MacArthur, though. It's going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower, the guy who was in charge of the amphibious assault on D-Day in World War II. But MacArthur did come back, and he gave a speech and to Congress, you know, all these folks and so forth. But it was kind of a weird thing. In his speech, he talks about old soldiers never die; they just fade away. And in one respect, that kind of ultimately was the fact for Douglas MacArthur. I guess he met his comeuppance because President of the United States, he's the commander in chief, and they have the ability to fire, and he did. And Truman put other people in command in there, but we never were able to push the Chinese all the way back. And you got this back and forth, but ultimately a stalemate. And it was hard in the United States because it wasn't like World War II where you had like a movement and ultimately victory. Here it looked like, oh my gosh, this thing is going on and on and on. We kind of know a little bit about that in our own time with the war in Afghanistan. We don't have a clear victory, and a sense ultimately from people that, can we wrap this up? And as you get into 1951 and into 1952, the United States and the United Nations are going to have meetings with the North Koreans to see if they can figure out some way of, ending this conflict. And those discussions are going to drag on and on and on. And of course, one of the issues is what to do about soldiers who were captured on either side, right? I've got a little thing right here. If you were part of the United States forces that were captured by the North Koreans or the Chinese, you were put in a prisoner of war camp. And it was a fascinating thing because the Chinese and the North Koreans, they are very effective at setting up camps and using psychological means to brainwash, break down the mental resistance of the people who were in those camps, whether it's civilians or in this case, prisoners of war, military guys. Going through and telling them about all the horrible things the Americans did in the minute, and education is like, and fair amount of torture and no like packages from the Red Cross, no loving, friendly letters from home to encourage you. I mean, in fact, it was just ultimately after a while, I mean, the prison camps officials didn't even hardly have to have too many people involved because the prisoners of war, they weren't going anywhere. And I mean, many of them were just defeated. They got Dear John letters. See that? They got Dear John letter. A Dear John letter is basically, a letter from a wife or a girlfriend, and the North Koreans, Chinese would look at those letters and go, oh yeah, we'll hand this over. That way the guy knows that it's done in America. Yeah. And it's fascinating because brainwash, the idea is like eventually these guys will see that the cause is right for the communists, and then when we release them, they'll go back and well, maybe we can get them to work for us. There's a whole thing. Check it out. If you, I don't have the film queued up, but there was 2 different movies made called The Manchurian Candidate about what happens when a prisoner of war, United States military during the Korean War, is ultimately released and then comes back and ends up being almost like an agent for the Chinese communists or something. It's almost like the Winter Soldier or something like that. Anyway, very interesting stuff. But, okay. A downside, certainly, to the situation in in the Korean War. For the Korean population, very difficult. So many refugees, so many civilians getting bombed because the fighting is just taking place all over the place. And you're ultimately going to have, in the northern part of Korea, 2 million civilians killed as a result of bombing, atrocities being carried out on both sides. You'll see this in the CNN video. When is this thing going to be over? Truman decides not to run again. In 1952, the Republicans under Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, senator from California, Republican senator, they're going to be elected as president and vice president. So here you got Dwight D. Eisenhower doing the oath of office, and there you got Truman right there. And it's Eisenhower's gig from here on out. So what has changed? Well, Eisenhower is in charge, and he's looking at the situation, and you can't just change that and so forth. Is there anything that's changed on the other side of the dynamic? Well, you still got Kim and you still got Mao, but Stalin, who was the #1 Soviet kind of guy, he dies of natural consequences or natural circumstances in March 5th of 1953. And that kind of creates a circumstance whereby the new Soviet leadership looks and says, you know, this thing is not going anywhere. Let's get this wrapped up. Let's get it solved. Let's get an armistice. And so finally, on July 27th, 1953, there will be an armistice reached at the abandoned city, border city of Panmunjom, really a village. And you'll have that demilitarized zone set up. The war's not officially over, but the fighting will be ceased. One thing holding that up, though, was the exchange of prisoner issue. You had all these different prisoners, North Korean soldiers who were being kept in prisoner of war camps in South Korea and so forth. Well, half of them didn't want to go back, right? Ultimately, and of course, North Korea's like, what do you mean they don't want to come back? Of course they want to come back. What are you? 75,000 of these men ultimately go back to North Korea. 12,000 forces of the United Nations, prisoners of war, will be returned. So you'll have that big prisoner exchange. As you look ultimately, though, at the cost, and here I've got the map up again of the war, right? How it starts off with North Korea taking it all the way to Busan, and then the South Koreans with the United Nations and the US pushing it all the way up to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese counter assault pushing it all the way back, and then ultimately, here you go, there's the armistice line, the DMZ, demilitarized zone, which is still there, and you don't go walking across the DMZ. So what are the casualties? What is the result? You have 54,000 United States soldiers dead, and another 3,000 from among our United Nations allies. 54,000. Although it's interesting in retrospect, what do we have in the COVID in the United States? We've already exceeded that. Anyway, but a lot of people. 500,000 Chinese dead. I mean, they paid a high price for this. 3 million casualties among the Koreans, if you add them all up. So dead and injured, and of course about 5 million homeless. You know, heaven help you if you got stuck on the wrong side. It would be the wrong side, because I mean that's where you are. Some Korean refugees make their way to the United States, but a lot of them ultimately living in South Korea. One thing that is very important, as far as the Chinese are concerned, they were able to fight the biggest free power in the world to a standstill. And they saw that as a big victory for them. I mean, they'd only been around for what, less than a year or so. And the People's Republic of China is a fact from that point on. And this is very big, because prior to that time, I mean, if you look back even 100 years before that, China was getting beaten up this way, that way by the Opium Wars and British troops. And I mean, everybody was coming in and so forth. But now, as they enter the 1950s, China is a strong country that can tangle with the United States of America, and they don't look back. I mean, they're like, national security, we're going to do this. Eventually, they will figure out how to do capitalism, and they will increase the strength of their economy in a big way. And so that's why today you look, and if they're not number one, they're moving in on it. Number one economy in the entire world. China is a big deal, and this is a big fact that comes out of the Korean War. Will it be solved? No. Will there continue to be fighting? No, not so much. Will there still be tensions? Yeah, but there's going to be tensions all over the place as we look at the Cold War, and we continue to look, and the ramifications and details and all kinds of crazy things going all over the place. So watch the Cold War video on Korea, episode 5, and we got another one coming up for you next time. Stay safe, be healthy,